this is a sort of a gaming report that has come out by the German Marshall Funds, and it creates a very different scenario. There are two scenarios that have been created, a limited scenario and the bigger scenario. So my question is, will any conflict with China have an impact on the Chinese society, standing of Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party, if I go by the report?
We are, Karthikeya, assuming here that there is going to be a war between, a hot war between Taiwan and mainland China. And we are saying that this could either be limited or it could be an all-out war, which to me remains a pretty far-fetched imagination. Of course, it goes back to 2021 Senate Armed Forces Committee's hearings, when the Indo-Pacific Command commander, Admiral Philip Davidson, had mentioned that China is planning in 6 years to invade Taiwan. Of course, right following him, in another congressional hearing, the chairman of the Chief of Staff Committee, General Mark Milley, had clarified that China is only preparing for it and it may not actually invade. And this all goes back to that year, President Xi Jinping advancing the time for PLA to prepare ability to invade Taiwan from 2035 to 2027. That is how the story goes. And therefore, this year and next year are supposed to be repeatedly, bringing this issue forward for various simulation exercises and studies and estimates and so on. My assumption is that it will be really impossible to think of and very dangerous game to play if China is pushed. I'm saying China is pushed. China is not willing to do that, but if China is pushed for whatever reasons to actually invade Taiwan. We understand about 600,000 Chinese annually visit Taiwan. Another about nearly 500,000, not 5,000, I think 300,000 Americans visit Taiwan regularly. So the population intermingling is itself such that to then say, if there are 10,000 soldiers killed, what is the number of population that will be dying on that small island? And we are assuming enormous death and destruction to lead to that kind of casualties, etc., etc. Chinese would to their ultimate, they will try to avoid any such exercise because they are waiting for whatever 12 countries are left that recognize Taiwan as a nation state to really reduce and become zero one day. And nothing will have to be done in that case. And some kind of concessional arrangements like in Hong Kong and Macau will be also extended to Taiwan. So I think it's an interesting study. Studies are also done on nuclear attacks on Delhi and Mumbai and so on. These are interesting studies and they serve some purpose, I suppose.
But it can be of the propaganda effect. Professor Soren Singh, I don't undermine that possibility. But there were a couple of questions which I had. General Kocher, you see, people said that the war in Ukraine will have a direct bearing on the Russian state and society. I haven't seen that in the last 3 years. This particular report says that any armed conflict with Taiwan, with the so-called, in the military terms, the porcupine strategy of the Taiwan, it will have an impact on the Communist Party of China, the standing of Xi Jinping. And the report also talks about, can Xi Jinping overestimate the capability of PLA, because PLA has not fought a war after 1976. So there are also a number of nuances which are important. So my question to you is, how is Taiwan theatre different from Ukraine? Let's put that in perspective for our viewer.
Okay, very interesting, because in the Ukraine, Black Sea area, Russians have suffered very heavy casualties whenever they have tried to launch invasion. Almost 20 ships they have lost there. So a difference now, you see, from mainland China to Taiwan, it's around 80 miles. So roughly you can say about 120 odd kilometers. Any kind of a mass mobilization, see, when you are planning an amphibious assault, when you are planning a main assault on Taiwan, Taiwan has been divided into 5 zones as far as the Chinese planning is concerned. because China would like to encircle or blockade Taiwan from all sides, and it would be preempted by a missile strike or a cyber strike, and it will be a blackout of Taiwan the way we actually saw happening in Venezuela. So, if we take that scenario, uh, a surprise is lost. The first important aspect is that Taiwan will come to know through its surveillance devices, everything, that China is planning an attack. It can't happen that China is carrying out a military drill and all of a sudden the Chinese start striking you, because China requires a very sizable force, at least 3 lakh to 4 lakh troops to uh, meaningfully you attack Taiwan, because Taiwan itself has got in excess of about 1.5 lakh troops. Secondly, uh, so once this mobilization starts, Taiwan has it has invested in high range missiles called Yunfang. This has a range of 2,000 kilometers. So it is very, very easy for Taiwan to target the mobilization of the troops, and there are going to be heavy casualties. Supposing we take a scenario that casualties have occurred, and China will still be able to launch that attack. It will happen because casualties are not going to deter the Chinese to that extent that they stop their planning for the attack. Now, once they come onto the mainland, and amphibious kind of operation will have to be launched. So this is the difference between the Ukraine and scenario in this scenario, because here from 5 sides you will have to carry out amphibious landing, and what has been uh, uh, tactically deduced is there are only 14 landing points available. And it is because of the kind of terrain these islands have. It is 60% of the terrain is mountainous, and 40% of the terrain has got that a high density of buildings. So we going to find urban warfare here also to a great extent will have to be done.
Okay.
Secondly, the amphibious part is to establish a beachhead is going to be very, very difficult, because that is the first part of the amphibious landing. And your beachhead is extremely vulnerable. And from the coast on to the mainland, there are, rice paddies all over. So rice paddies, terrain is like this, that you tank warfare and armored warfare is almost ruled out here. So you will have to carry out with your lighter vehicles and foot soldiers, and you will have to move on roads, and that would be under surveillance. You will be attacked. So my your ultimate analysis is saying that I tend to agree with this report in terms of casualties, because the casualties are going to be very, very high. I can't subscribe to the figure of 1 lakh, because you can't actually predict casualties in this manner. But sufficient to say in excess of around 50,000 troops. And China, with a one child policy, which has manifested Chinese army also. Once we study the Chinese army on the Western Front, uh, China is not going to take this risk. And even if Xi loses in excess of 10,000 men, I think he has lost that battle, because morally, I think the people are going to be this thing. So my actual analysis is that China will not like to go for a full-fledged attack. I tend to agree with Professor Swaran Singh that
Okay.
he is at the most
Okay.
you be a cyber, or it'll be a blockade. And by the time the blockade takes place, the US intervention forces are going to be in place.
Okay.
So he'll have to contend with that also.
Okay. Anushka, your opening comment on this, because I'm much more interested in the context of the Chinese Communist Party, you know.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I think when studies like this come out, and because cross-strait relations, China-Taiwan dynamics are so important to geopolitics or geoeconomics in general today, we see a lot of studies like this, and there are always both extremes of the argument that are very easy to talk about, right? The one extreme is that China is going to fail drastically and it'll be these many casualties or more, or the other extreme that it's going to be a minor conflict, as the report itself puts it, and the blockade or the taking over of Matsu and Pangu will be, or Chinmen will be very easy, and the Chinese society will suffer drastically. But what brings both the extremes of the spectrum together is the idea that hence Xi Jinping will be dissuaded to take on something like this. But aside from debating the numbers themselves or the assumptions of the report, I think it's important to look at the nuance of what we need to think about differently. So, for example, you talked about the Chinese Communist Party, right? Its legitimacy. Whenever there is conflict, it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that there will be casualties. India faced something. The Air Force chief came onto the press briefing and said that which conflict doesn't have casualties, right? Just to take that sentiment, I think it shouldn't be a surprise that the PLA will lose forces, the Taiwanese will probably lose more, the Americans will, and so will apparently the Japanese and others, right? But whose losses, but we have to apply the law of proportionality here. Whose losses um, ultimately have them face a bigger challenge than the other? So for the Chinese, I think a few things that we underplay are a that we it's okay to assuage some of our concerns vis-a-vis the Chinese by telling ourselves that they haven't been in a prolonged conflict since Vietnam. But the fact is that every single day they themselves are, without any naivety, recognizing where their loopholes are. And so if you look at coverage of what the PLA is up to on a day-to-day basis, they're plugging in that loopholes consistently. So this is not to say that they're going to win the war, or if there's an armed intervention, it's going to go the PLA's way completely. But they're not naive, like I said. They recognize where their
Okay.
challenges are, and that's where their budget, their procurement, their TTP, their procedures,
Okay.
everything is targeted in that direction. As for the society and the Communist Party itself, again, another thing that we kind of underestimate is emotive rigor in questions like this, right? We often look for signs as to when the invasion might happen. It will happen with the mobilization of, say, 3 lakh forces or anything of the sort. But I think if the question is of flailing legitimacy within China, that itself is possible, that itself might possibly trigger a move toward Taiwan. It doesn't have to be an invasion itself, or a willingness to take control, but it
Okay.
could start the bombing of these outlying islands or a complete
Yes.
blockade. And all of these would have significant
Absolutely.
consequences, and still be something that Xi Jinping or his army chooses to do because of factors that go beyond the technicalities that we imagine.
Absolutely.